Street makes a distinction between mind-independent values and mind-dependent values. And Street's mind-independent values are the same as Mackie's objective values. According to mind-independent conceptions of value, this is quoting from Street, some things are valuable in a way that is robustly independent of our valuing them. There are at least some things that possess their value in a way that is independent of the evaluative attitudes that we might happen to hold toward them, whereby evaluative attitudes I mean mental states such as an agent's values, cares, desires, states of approval and disapproval, unreflective evaluative tendencies, and so on. So, to repeat a point that we've made before, on a mind-independent or objective conception of value, you ought not to stab your TA, no matter what you or your society think or feel. Whether you ought not to stab your TA is one question, whether you or your society approve or disapprove of this action is quite another. Okay, so that's the distinction we find in Street, and we find one half of that distinction in Mackie. Now here is one of the crucial passages in Street's essay. Suppose that moral truths are objective or mind-independent. And this is where the bit about evolution comes in. To explain why we evolved with a tendency to accept these views, there is no reason to suppose that these evaluative views are true, and that it promoted reproductive success to recognize such truths. The best explanation is simpler. All we need to notice is that a creature who accepts these evaluative views, valuing its survival, health, and offspring, for example, will tend to look out for itself and its offspring, and so will, of course, leave more descendants than a creature who, say, despises its own survival, health, and offspring. Truth and falsity have nothing to do with which values would proliferate and which would die out. So here is the argument, or at least one part of Street's overall argument. If there are objective, mind-independent values, right, values that just don't depend on our attitudes or our desires or what we approve or disapprove of, then our beliefs about them would only be true by a fluke, because the evolutionary explanation of our beliefs doesn't assume that they are true. And as we saw when we were talking about knowledge and Plato, a lucky guess isn't knowledge. Quoting from Street again, if there are objective values, then truth and falsity have nothing to do with which views about values would proliferate and which would die out. So, she concludes, if there are objective, mind-independent values, we don't have knowledge of them. If our moral beliefs are true, then that is just a fluke. Exercise for you: set out the argument so that it's valid, and then consider the question, is it sound? Okay, so Street could have stopped there. That would have been an interesting enough conclusion all by itself. But she doesn't. She goes on. The evolutionary theory of our origins is overwhelmingly supported by our best science. Taking that as a fixed point, I suggest that it is much more plausible to think that a mind-independent conception of value, that is, to put it in Mackie's terminology, the view that values are objectively prescriptive, is false, than it is to think that we have no idea how to live, which is the conclusion that results if we pair a mind-independent conception of value with an evolutionary genealogy, that is, an evolutionary origin, of valuing. So Street's conclusion is not that we have no idea whether it's wrong to leave the child drowning in the pond, but rather that because we do know that we ought to hop in and save the child, values have to be mind dependent. They can't be mind independent. She denies then Mackie's view that ordinary moral judgments include a claim to objectivity. She thinks that ordinary moral judgments are by and large true and are known to be so, and this can only be because, Street thinks, the right conception of value is mind dependent, not mind independent. So let's just leave the matter there with a question. Do we really want to say, as apparently Street is committed to saying, that the wrongness of stabbing your TA somehow derives from our attitudes towards stabbing innocents? Paper 2 topics are up on the website. Please fill out the midterm survey. We very much value your opinion, and if there's a consensus for certain changes and we can make them, that's what we'll do. I hope to have an interview with Sharon Street up by the weekend, and next week is free will, which is always a great topic. You can do the reading or not, I don't care. It's entirely up to you. I'll see you next week.